Everyone has their happy place, a favorite vacation destination, a cabin by the lake, somewhere to escape the daily grind. For author, broadcaster, and musician Grant Lawrence, that place is BC's Desolation Sound. Now, 12 years after his award-winning memoir, Adventures in Solitude, What Not to Wear to a Nude Potluck and Other Stories from Desolation Sound, he's back with the sequel, Return to Solitude, More Desolation Sound Adventures with the Cougar Lady, Russell the Hermit, the Spaghetti Bandit, and others. Welcome to the City News Bookshelf, Grant.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks for having me.
So I take it you have a thing for long titles.
That's a nonfiction thing. You know, the title of the book is Return to Solitude. But if you compare fiction books and nonfiction books, the nonfiction books often try to sell the rest of the book in the subtitle. So the subtitles are usually very long for nonfiction books. The example being my first book pretty much is known as Adventures in Solitude. That's the title of the book. But the full title is, I'll see if I can even remember it, Adventures in Solitude, What Not to Wear to a Nude Potluck and Other Stories from Desolation Sound. So these nonfiction books is just something I've learned in the publishing world, is that, these nonfiction titles can get really, really long. At least the subtitles can.
So what made you come out with the book now, 12 years after the original?
Well, the reason is that it's nonfiction. That's the simple reason. And when I say it's nonfiction, that means that you gotta wait for stories to happen. You have to wait for life to unfold. You have to wait for these real story arcs to emerge. And when the first book came out, and it was relatively successful, and it was kind of a surprise for the publisher. It actually got turned down everywhere, and once it eventually came out, it sold. And so the publisher wanted to rush a second version, and I probably would have been a more successful, if possibly less satisfied author, if I had rushed a second edition of just kind of scraps and flotsam and jetsam left over from the first book. But I wanted to wait, and I wanted to really see what would happen with these real people that I wrote about in the first book. And so that took 10 years to a point of where I said, okay, I think enough has happened that I can pull another full book out of this. And, you know, there's some of the people that I get into their lives in the first book have come to their end in this world. And some of those exits have been very macabre and very strange and very dark. And, you know, that's the kind of stuff that you just can't make up. You know, one of the characters in the book is a real friend of mine named Bernard the German. And I would challenge any fiction writer to come up with the actual way that Bernard the German died. You just couldn't do it. And that's why I write nonfiction, because what I find is that the truth is stranger than fiction.
Now, the first book talks about your childhood vacations on Desolation Sound, the nerdy kid with the unflappable athletic parents. Now in the sequel, Return to Solitude, you're the dad. How does it feel being the adult in the story?
Yeah, that's definitely the way I've changed. It's certainly a lot less footloose and fancy free. It's a lot, I mean, when I rediscovered Desolation Sound after a long rejection of it in my teen years and in my 20s when I was in a touring band, I wanted nothing to do with the place. And then when I finally rediscovered it in my late 20s and early 30s, I went, oh, geez, what was wrong with me? This place is amazing. I partied, you know, I partied hard up there. It was a really fun place to just kind of let loose and, you know, get day drunk and, you know, go kayaking and swimming in the phosphorescence, nude in the night. But with kids, you can't really go crazy like that, you know, all day and all night, then sleep till whenever you want to get up. There's a incredibly heightened sense of responsibility when it comes to having kids in Desolation Sound, because it's a rough, rocky, relatively it's a place with a lot of potential hazards. Let's say tripping hazards, like 30-foot cliffs and stuff like that. And so I am way more responsible. I am way more alert. I am way more attuned to their safety and my wife's safety and all of that kind of stuff. So I think there's just a couple of the ways I've changed. And I hardly ever get to go kayaking or paddleboarding anymore because I'm always right on top of the kids.
Are there things that you do that remind you of your parents?
That's a great question. I think I'm pretty different, but then when I was a little kid, my memories are my parents yanking me out of bed and dragging me into the car and maybe putting on the lap belt because there weren't car seats back then, and then racing to the BC ferries to try to make that first sailing and not miss it and get stuck in the parking lot in Horseshoe Bay waiting for trolls to open. And I hated that. I absolutely hated that as a kid. And then once we got to the Sunshine Coast Highway, I'd be fire hose vomiting all over the back seat because it's about one of the windiest roads you can find anywhere. But then here I am, some 40 years later, and what am I doing? I'm dragging my kids out of bed in the dark, strapping them into the car seats. I've got a Tupperware bowl in the back seat to catch their vomit. I'm racing to get to the ferry. So I guess in that way, I am the same as my parents, but in a lot of ways, I'm a lot different too.
Well, the circle of life continues. There you go.
It does.
Now, the book is great in that it's part memoir, part travelogue. You get into, of course, how the far from Desolation Sound was named, and you get into the history with Captain George Vancouver, who doesn't sound like he was much of a fan of the place.
No, the history there is actually quite interesting. First of all, the area really wasn't as desolate as he claimed. There was a thriving First Nations community there, three nations that came together peacefully, the Klahus, the Hamalko, and the Talaman, all of whom still have communities and a great presence up in Desolation Sound, and some thriving businesses as well, like the Lund Hotel and the Klahus Lodge and places like that. And but when Captain Vancouver was up there in the late 1700s, he was tasked to find the Northwest Passage before France or Spain could find it, so they could claim it for England. And he sailed up the west coast of North America, where it's relatively a straight line from pretty much Mexico all the way up to Puget Sound, with a couple of little jags inside, like the San Francisco Bay and the Columbia River. But other than that, it's pretty much a clean straight line up the Oregon coast, up the Washington coast. And then you hit Puget Sound and it starts to get really complicated. And you get into the Salish Sea and it gets even more complicated. You get up past the Salish Sea, which is where Desolation Sound starts. And it is one of the most complicated, fractured, broken, beautiful coastlines in the entire world, similar to Scandinavia or the southern reaches of Chile, basically where the Ice Age broke up the land into deep, deep, deep inlets or fjords. And so poor Captain Vancouver had to go down the end of every single one of those fjords. Now, what he did not know is that every single one is a dead end. Now we know that, but he had to go through that and map it and chart it. And by the time he got to Desolation Sound, he was getting incredibly frustrated at this process, as you can imagine, because every single one of those inlets could have been potentially the Northwest Passage and a route to Europe. And so boom, 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 dead end, dead end, dead end. It was July. It was late 1700s. He's sitting in the pouring rain in Desolation Sound, and he couldn't see any living thing around him. And so he named it Desolation Sound because he thought it was one of the most forlorn and ugliest places he had ever seen in all of his travels. They had just come from Hawaii, and he stamped it with that name, and it has kind of both kept people away and drawn people ever since. He didn't maybe realize it at the time, but there's a real poetry in the name of Desolation Sound, both inviting and foreboding. And it's interesting that he did it with almost it was a write-off to him and an insult, but it's endured all these many hundreds of years.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. What draws people to Desolation Sound? So many characters that we meet in these books. What is it about this place that draws them in?
Well, there's a few different reasons why people are drawn to Desolation Sound. So, for one, going back to First Nations, it's an incredibly bountiful area when it comes to sea life and food. You know, one of the things that Captain Vancouver noticed with the local First Nations is that their teeth, the British sailors, their teeth were falling out of their mouths due to nutrition and being on a ship for a couple of years and lack of vitamin C. They met the First Nations of the Salish Sea and in Desolation Sound, and they had incredible, perfect, white, gleaming teeth. And it was from a very, very, very high calcium and high vitamin-rich diet that they got from the ocean and the forest around them, berries and clams and fish. And it was just an incredibly healthy diet at the time. And so that drew the First Nations because it was a kind of a Garden of Eden where the water was warm and everything would grow. And then after that, it began to attract a kind of yachting elite because the area is so magnificent and so beautiful. So everyone from John Wayne in the 30s and 40s to Oprah Winfrey and Brad Pitt recently have all yachted into Desolation Sound on these giant glistening white pearls, these ships that cruise up through the inlets. And then in the 60s and early 70s, Desolation Sound proved to be an escape for draft dodgers and hippies and back to the landers, because it's essentially the end of the road. And so when the hippies got in their Volkswagen vans, when the draft was coming, and they would just get in their vans and they would rattle up Highway 101, which goes right through Hollywood and goes right through downtown San Francisco. It also crosses the Canadian border and it goes right up the Sunshine Coast. And Highway 101 comes to a dead stop in the town of Lund. It goes no further. That's the end of the road. And so the hippies would go to the end of the road and then go, all right, well, the law could probably still find us here. So they got in boats and they went out to Desolation Sound and they formed communes and little settlements and all sorts of things. And some of them lasted and some of them didn't. Some of the hippies have been there for 50 years and some of them barely lasted one summer.
Now, speaking of people trying to get away from it all, one of the characters that you talk about in the book is Russell the Hermit. You credit him with bringing a, quote, loser kid out of his shell, referring to yourself.
Yeah.
How did he do that?
Well, you mentioned my parents earlier. My parents not only were they quite athletic and fit and trim, and my mom was very pretty and my dad very, very handsome. They were also, they were conservative, really conservative, and so conservative that my dad hated the hippie lifestyle. He was more kind of, when it came to being an outdoorsman, he was more kind of the guy you see in those old Marlboro ads, but without the cigarette, or, those those sportsman cigarette hunting ads, those guys, with the sunglasses and the little caps and everything and the Mackinac jackets. He was a lot more like that when it came to the outdoors. He wasn't into the back to the lander thing. He thought hippies were dirty and lazy, so much so that he famously would not allow us to listen to the Beatles in our family, because he thought that John Lennon was responsible for the entire hippie movement, that he thought was just a scourge on society. So when we got up to our cabin in Desolation Sound, we were my dad was quite dismayed to realize that there was a squatter in the cove right beside our cabin that was a full-blown hippie. I mean, this guy looked like a cross between Willie Nelson and Charles Manson, but he was a really nice guy, and his name was Russell, and we called him Russell the Hermit. And he eventually became an unlikely friend to my father. They actually became really good friends. It was literally my dad's only friend with hair past their earlobes or with a beard. And then Russell became somewhat of a mentor to me when he realized how square my parents were. He said, "Kid, there's a whole world out there that you have no idea what's going on." And so he introduced me to a lot of insurgent music that these days we think, oh, Jimi Hendrix, like everybody knows Jimi Hendrix. Well, for a 11, 12-year-old kid, hearing Jimi Hendrix play the guitar melted my mind. It was completely, I mean, we had 3 tapes in the car. My parents didn't go very deep. It was the ABCs almost. It was an ABBA cassette, a Beach Boys cassette. That's as wild as they got. And a Carpenters cassette. So the ABCs, and that was it. That's as far as the cassettes went. And so, hearing Jimi Hendrix or hearing the Velvet Underground or hearing the riffs of Creedence Clearwater Revival, these were just like, these basically opened up this portal into rock and roll, where I have been entrenched in music essentially for the rest of my life as a music journalist and as a singer in a rock band. It all started with Russell the Hermit. And ironically, there was no electricity up there. So he would tell me the names. Like he would say things like, your dad likes Elvis Presley. I've got to tell you, Elvis, phony, didn't write any of his own songs, never wrote a song in his life. You got to check out Chuck Berry. He wrote all the songs. This guy wrote the rock and roll book, the blueprint. So I go get Chuck Berry's Great 38, his greatest hits record of all his 38 singles. And just, again, mind blown. I still have that cassette right over there in that closet behind me that I got from Russell. But so I would write the list down, go back to Vancouver, and I would start hunting at that time for these cassette tapes. And then that turned into vinyl records. And I still am a music hunter to this day. And, he showed me all sorts of books. I just found a photo the other day of me at the cabin lying on the couch, and I'm reading something. I squinted at the photo and I'm reading Catcher in the Rye, because that's the book that he suggested that I read. And that book had a major, major impact on me. It was the first time I had read about, teenage apathy and mental illness and, just going to movies and sitting in the theater all day and letting the movies just end and start, and skipping school. And I have never read anything like it. And so whether that had a negative or positive effect on me, I'm not sure. But Russell was certainly a mentor. In the new book, Return to Solitude, I learn a lot more about Russell that I didn't know. And that he wasn't quite as Crocodile Dundee as he appeared. A friend of mine once said, be careful up there in Desolation Sound, because where there's sunshine, there is shadow. And there was a lot more shadows in Russell's life than I realized when I was an 11-year-old boy. And I get into that in the new book.
A bit of a sad story, not to give it away, but But it all comes back to Russell the Hermit for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this book is a little bit darker than the first book. The first book is kind of, all the sunshine and innocence of a 6-year-old to about an 11-year-old kid, just realizing that these characters aren't going to bite. These people aren't going to bite. They actually have really fascinating stories. And then in the second book, it's kind of like, well, where do these stories actually go? And what is the real reason that these people have escaped to Desolation Sound? Are they? But here's the question that I posed to myself and that I tried to answer in the new book. Are these people running to, or are they running from? And a lot of them, it turned out, were in a way running from life, running from responsibility, running from accountability, and all sorts of stuff like that are important in life.
What do you hope people take away from the book?
That's a good question too, John. I think that first of all, the reason that I write the book is because I really love adventure, and I really love it when people take a chance and do things that 95% of us would never do. That we wouldn't leave our homes and we wouldn't walk across a mountain range and just where there are no trails and no roads, or we wouldn't just drop everything and buy a rickety old sailboat and try to sail around the world. But I'm inspired by the people that do those things, the misfits. And so if anything, I hope that people take away, a sense of adventure and a sense of going for it and a sense of reading about lives well lived and lives that do not follow the beaten track. Russell used to compare society to insects, downtowns. He would say it's nothing more than an anthill. It's nothing more than a beehive. It's just a whole bunch of people filing in, following the queen bee, and then filing out. And we're no greater than ants or bees. And that was kind of a revelation for me, because I do that. I go downtown to work and then I come home and I'm with everybody doing the same thing. And if you look at an anthill, there's a lot of similarities. And so Russell didn't do that. He refused to do that. And a lot of the people in Return to Solitude refused to do that. And that's what inspires me. And I hope some other people take some inspiration from that as well.
The name of the book is Return to Solitude. It's available from Harbor Publishing. My thanks to author Grant Lawrence.
My thanks to you, John. That was a great chat.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Excellent interview.